So the purpose of this video is there are many times where I've treated patients where they will come in with an injury that they've suffered from either a one-time yard work event that's been plaguing them for months, or they've been having repetitive injuries every time they go to do certain yard work tasks. Now, some of you may not love yard work and just do it because it needs to be done, and others of you may love yard work and are just suffering every time you go out there. So the goal of this video is to hopefully educate patients on the common errors that they put their bodies in and why this might lead to injury, and then hopefully give you ideas and tips of how to either minimize stresses to prevent injury altogether, or at least minimize discomfort, so when you are trying to rest later on, you can get out of pain quicker. The thing that I find important about all this is I myself have had a back injury before, and I know what it's like to do things the wrong way and the right way, and I can appreciate how important it is to be aware of your body when you're doing things so that you can help your body feel where the stress is and how to adjust for the stress to keep yourself safe. When we think of athletes, athletes will train and work on strength and flexibility and their speed, but they will have coaches to help them hone skills to optimize their performance in whatever their sport is. As physical therapists, we have the knowledge of physics and lever arms and the different types of things that are going on in the joint or soft tissues when you put your body in certain positions. And therefore, dependent on the person's injury, we have a general idea about what positions or movements would be safer for an individual. And although you might be somebody that works out on a regular basis, and that's a good thing, it doesn't necessarily guarantee there wouldn't be an injury prevention, because again, you can be strong but place your body in a bad position over and over and over again, and over time that can lead to injury just with repetitive stress, or again, it could be a one-time event because the lever arm itself or the stress itself was so great for the tissue could not tolerate it. Now, I think one of the hardest things that people deal with when we are going over body mechanics is they want to do it the right way, but they go back to old habits. Now, when an athlete learns a new skill, they don't practice that skill once or twice. They have to practice that skill over and over and over again, so it is second nature in competition. With this video, I would encourage you to listen to the different sections that you feel apply to your injury and listen to them a few times to really listen to the words, listen to what the common error is, and try and apply that to wherever you're working in your yard. When you go out to work, you're going to need to slow your body down. You're going to need to think about, develop your proprioception or body awareness to feel, where am I letting the force yield? Is it where it should be? Or again, am I starting to feel it across my old injury? And if you do start to feel that injury, again, we are going to go over how you might need to pace yourself or change how you do things. So in subsequent videos, I will be going over different exercises we might encourage people to do to keep themselves strong and to keep those tissues to have the stamina to do yard work, but also how to work on injury management or getting yourself out of pain if you indeed just went a little too far. So my hope is with this video that we can help people see that, with physical therapy, it's not just about athletics, it's not just about how to keep yourself flexible, but it's also about how physical therapy offers people ergonomics, different ways of thinking with, again, not just yard work, but how you do housework around the home or how you set up your office. So again, just really trying to enlighten people about all the wealth of knowledge that physical therapists have. So in this section, I'll be talking about shoveling. Again, I'll demonstrate the common errors first, and then I'll use the spine model to hopefully help illustrate the forces that are at play here. And then I will show the ideal way we'd like patients to go through shoveling. Again, I would encourage you to watch the video a few times if you know this is a common error for you, because it's going to take time to kind of maybe let some of the words sink in, as well as watching how I move, so that again, when you're out doing yard work, you're going to have to slow your body down and really feel these things, because you're having to train your body on a whole new way of moving. That's just going to take, like we talked about, a lot of practice. So when we're talking about shoveling, I realize that there are variables at play. You know, shoveling on an upslope is nicer because you don't have to bend over. So we're probably saying this is more when people are shoveling level or possibly down a little deeper into their hole. And then obviously the type of ground you have makes a difference. You know, rocky soil or clay is a lot harder to shovel than something that's nice and smooth. So when we're doing this, again, the idea is that you would apply the principles to whatever type of soil you have. But again, there might be variables about how long you could do certain types of shoveling depending on how hard the soil conditions are. So with the first part, it's more when people are putting their foot in and they go to push. So a lot of times people push with their foot and they drive with their hands, but they tend to bend over at their waist to do so. So we tend to see this type of motion over and over again. So there is this flexion movement happening at the spine, okay? And then again, depending on how hard the ground is, if the ground is rocky and hard or clay and hard, the ground is going to resist the shovel being pushed through it. It's going to push back. So the more the ground pushes back against you every time you hit it with the shovel, there's going to be a shear force backwards. And over time, if we have this flexion force happening in combination with a shear force at the same time, there is a lot of stress to the ligaments around the spine, the joints around the spine, and of course then locally the spinal muscles. So when you are going to go shovel, we would encourage you to make sure that as you go to drive with your hands, you are aware to keep your chest up. So again, I bend my knee, I keep my chest up to make sure that I'm not allowing a flexion force, but again, I'm keeping my spine in neutral. Also, I'm making sure before I commit to driving the shovel into the ground, I am tightening my abdominals and my thoracic muscles to make sure that I can hold myself there against the force of the ground. And I tighten and I push, and I tighten and I push. And again, how hard you have to tighten and push again is dependent on the type of soil that you're doing, or it also might be dependent on how long you've been out there doing it. Obviously, shoveling nice, loose dirt is a lot easier than shoveling a bunch of rocks. So the next part we have is, now that you've shoveled, it's when you have to go lift whatever it is out of the hole. Obviously, the deeper the hole is, the more challenging it is. The shallower the hole is, the easier it is. So I get that there's a lot of variables at play. So again, you're going to have to see how your body is doing and really feel, am I starting to let my body yield to these forces just because of fatigue? Or again, I'm so involved with my task that I'm not thinking about it. So if I'm going to go lift the load out of the hole, again, the common error is people bend over and then they start to lift, okay? So the problem is I bent my knees, but not enough for my back not to bend over this way. When my back's in this position, my neck also has more shear force against it, like so. And then if I'm gonna lift whatever this weight is, so now I have flexion on my back, under load, flexion at my, extension, shear force at my neck, under load. So again, there's two areas where we could potentially have repetitive strain starting to kick in. So again, if I am flexing forward to pick up a load, my neck will extend to try and help stabilize. But both of these positions place my lumbar spine at end range flexion, my cervical spine at end range extension. And then again, when you have gravity pulling you this way, and then plus the weight of whatever it is in your shovel, that's more shear force coming down on the neck and the spine. So again, not only do we need to be aware of keeping the spine in neutral, but again, how am I engaging my muscles to help stabilize my spine there? Again, dependent on how long have I been shoveling or the load or the weight that my body is dealing with. So again, if I'm having to get down low because the hole is deeper, or again, maybe I'm getting down low because I need a lot more leg strength to lift whatever it is I'm lifting. I have to make sure not to bend over, but I have to bend my knees, again, keep my chest tall. And when I bend my knees and I keep my chest tall, by default, my neck automatically lines up into a more neutral position. And then I have to make sure when I go to lift, I don't let the weight pull me down, but instead I really have to squeeze my buttocks, lift my chest up, okay? So again, I have to go to commit to bending my knees, keep my chest tall, squeeze my gluteals, lift my chest up. For my neck, I might imagine I'm always pressing the crown of my head tall so I don't shear my neck forward, and I lift up, okay? So then the last part that gets people is once they have the load here, if they're trying to put it into a wheelbarrow or off to the side, a lot of times they tend to keep their feet still and they'll twist or they'll twist, okay? So the problem is when I don't move my feet and I move my upper torso, I'm getting a lot of rotation. And again, maybe this doesn't bother you for 1 to 2 times. If you're doing this several times, the spine has this shear force on it with rotation. So again, if I'm here and my feet are not moving and I'm just twisting, it's all coming from my lumbar spine. And like I said, depending on the type of back that you have or repetitive injuries that you've had, over time, this can make the back very irritated. So it is important that when we have whatever it is in our hands, even if it's just a little bit, that I try and take a step and make sure to move my hands and feet together. Hands and feet together, okay? Or again, hands and feet together, either way, whichever you're moving. I still am tightening my abs and my glutes and my chest muscles to make sure I'm not being pulled down by this load, but again, make sure to move your hands and feet at the same time. So again, there was 3 parts to this. Again, how to shovel into the earth, how to lift the load, and then also how to dump the load depending on if, again, you're having to rotate and turn. So hopefully for those of you who shoveling is problematic, this gives you some ideas about how to minimize stress and injury. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is mattoxing or pickaxe. So there's 2 components to mattoxing and pickaxe. One is kind of bringing the tool back, and the other is the drive forward, okay? So the common error with bringing the axe back or the mattox back is that, again, people tend to plant their feet and then they want to pivot their back into extension, okay? So again, in this position, all of the weight of the mattox is behind my low back, and my low back has to compensate by going into this position. So the problem here is that we have these joints on our lumbar spine called our facets, and they're very small compared to our vertebral bodies. And so if we're going back under load, not just repetitively does this stress those joints, but now we also have a weight compressing them. So when we have to raise the mattox overhead, the ideal thing would be to try and be better about not necessarily extending our low back, but extending our chest. So again, when I extend my chest up, I have the hands overhead, but again, I'm not leaning back to create my drive down, but instead I'm lifting my body up, so I'm coming slightly up on my toes, and I'm lifting my chest up. And what this does is essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to maintain my spine staying straight, so all the weight is now being borne through the vertebral bodies, which are much bigger and can tolerate that type of load better than my facet joints. Again, in this position, I would still engage my back muscles and my abdominal muscles to help stabilize against the shear force of the weight of the head of the mattox. So again, I would come here, I tighten my abs, keep my chest tall, and I lift. I tighten my abs, keep my chest tall, and I lift, okay? The other thing is I have to be careful of my neck in this position. So again, if you have a neck that is susceptible to feeling irritated when you have to lift weight overhead repetitively, the other thing I have to be aware of is making sure as I lift the Maddox up and I'm coming up, I don't let my head shear backwards. And sometimes people's necks do that because the weight of the Maddox, even though it's being held in your hands, the head feels that and wants to go back. So again, what I have to do is I have to tighten my abs, lift my chest, and again, keep the crown of my head the tallest point as I bring this up, okay? So then the second part that gets people into trouble is the downswing. So again, this has a lot of weight on it. So if I'm coming down, it's gonna wanna pull my body forward this way, just by the fact that gravity is accelerating that motion. If I'm coming down and I'm just letting it fall this way repetitively, again, now we have this flexion force and again, the ground. So again, if this ground's hard, the Maddox is gonna hit and the back's gonna feel that shear force that we talked about with the shoveling. So as I come down, as we talked about before with the shoveling, and I move forward like this, I have, again, this flexion strain that's happening to the discs, the ligaments, the joints, but that again, depending on how hard the ground is, I have this shear force. So when I am coming here and I've tightened my abs, keep my chest tall, as I come down, I drop my knees hard, keep my chest tall. So my power comes through my legs. Tighten my abs, keep my chest tall, drop. So again, I'm letting gravity still carry the weight of the Maddox. I'm controlling the force, so by having my legs help me descend under control versus just letting the Maddox pull me forward. So again, tighten my abs, keep my chest tall, keep the crown of my head the tallest point, and I drop, okay? As I'm dropping, I still keep my chest tall, I still keep my chest tall and I still keep my abs tight and my glutes tight because again, I'm trying to stabilize against the force of the ground and in terms of the Maddox hitting it and not having it shear backwards. The last common error is where people put their feet as they're striking. So anytime the axe falls in front of my feet, it's going to be a lot easier to bend forward. If I have my stance be wider, then it's a lot easier to bend my knees and keep my chest tall because my base of support stabilizes and allows me to maintain my balance. The problem with this position is, again, it's a lot easier to bend over because it's hard to stabilize against the force of the Maddox. Again, I get that there are certain positions that this is hard to maintain depending on where you are in your yard, but by and large, this is the more stable position to make sure that if you're Maddoxing, you keep your weight in the middle of your feet and the Maddox lands just between the portion of your 2 feet to help you maintain balance. And then the big thing here is you have to keep moving your feet if you're progressing. If you start here, that's good, but then as soon as you start reaching, again, you're going to get yourself back in that hot water of having to really brace hard against this force to not flex your back. So again, this all comes down to making sure your hands and feet are moving together if you're moving to trench, all right? So hopefully this helps give you some ideas about how to Maddox safely if you have to do it, how to slow your body mechanics down, and I would encourage you to maintain a steady cadence of breathing when you do this. So if I take a deep breath in and I blow out as I drive, deep breath in. Sometimes that steady rhythm helps people stabilize their body to prevent themselves from just holding their breath and trying to drive it all the way through. Okay, so next up is hoeing. So if you just finished watching the Maddox portion, this is similar in quality. So when people hoe, a lot of times they tend to plant their feet and just bend over and do things and they keep moving their body. The problem is now they're keeping their body in this sustained flexion position that over time really gets to their back. So with the hoe, similar to when we talked about the Maddox, 2 parts are important. One, driving it into the earth, and then the actual movement. So again, when I drive the hoe into the earth, the common error is, again, people tend to plant their feet and then just bend from the waist. And again, they plant their feet and they bend forward. So as we discussed with our spinal model before, again, I have this repetitive force happening that now we have, again, flexion happening to the spine, and of course then, depending on how hard the earth is, the shear force going backwards through the spine, which can create more stress, again, to the ligaments and the joints in the back. The other thing that is important to think about is, and again, a lot of people don't, but if you find that your neck bothers you more so than your back with hoeing, a lot of times people tend to keep their necks in this, again, sustained position because they're looking out, because they're keeping their backs bent forward. So ideally, when you are hoeing, you would keep your knees bent, keep your chest tall, and again, just by the nature of this, as I hoe, I am making sure by bending my knees, keep my chest tall, my neck stays in neutral, my back stays in neutral. Again, I would make sure to tighten my abs, keep my chest tall, using my back muscles to stabilize myself against whatever the type of ground it is that I'm working against. And then the other part of it is again, people tend to want to plant their feet and move the hoe forward. So again, if I am doing this, I'd want to step as I drive. Step and drive. And so by stepping and driving, I'm assuring that my back has an easier time staying in neutral, because again, it's hard to balance if we just do it this way. And even if we're doing it this way, it's still a lot of weight coming out here that could drag us forward. So again, by stepping and doing this, then I have my legs to help me balance better. The second part of the hoe issue is that once you have the hoe into the earth, if you keep your feet planted and pull, there's all this friction of the earth. So again, as I'm pulling, depending on how hard the soil is, or again, how deep the hoe sunk, now there's all this drag that I'm having to do. And so you see people doing this and they pull their body, and they pull because again, they're trying to pull the hoe back to them. So if we think about when we stepped like so, the beauty is by having my leg here, that now my legs can help me pull back. So I have a lot more power. So I step, I keep my chest tall, I tighten my abs, I have my glutes on, and then as I pull back to me, I straighten up and I squeeze my buttocks. Straighten up, squeeze my buttocks, and my abs still stay on to contend against that pull. But again, my legs help do a lot more of the work than me just trying to manhandle this weight, okay? And you could do the same thing if you're using any sort of like other type of hoeing device to move in this direction. So then the other thing I'm going to talk about really quickly in this is raking, because raking has a similar quality in terms of people wanting to keep their feet planted and not move. So when people rake, a lot of times they bend over, they bend over, they bend over. So with raking, again, depending on how wet the leaves are, or again, maybe you're using a metal rake to move rocks, I need to make sure that I move my hands and feet together. So again, if I'm raking out in front of me, I would step, keep my chest tall, tighten my abs, pull. Step, keep my chest tall, pull my abs, pull. If I'm going laterally, I step laterally, pull in. Step laterally, pull in, okay? So again, the big thing with raking, because it's usually much more dynamic, because it's usually lighter work and people are trying to work all throughout their yard, is you really have to be aware to make sure to move your hands and feet at the exact same time. You have to be aware of keeping your chest tall, and you have to be aware of, depending on the force, or again, how wet or heavy things are, how hard are you bracing? Because again, if you look good, in terms of your form looks good, but you're not bracing enough. As I create this drag, your spine will feel that shear. So if you're raking and you still feel your back is bothering you, and you really do think you are moving with good form, then the question would be, well, are you bracing hard enough? So I hope that these two ideas give you better ways of managing any back or neck stresses that you have when you're out hoeing or raking in your yard. So this next section we're going to talk about pruning. So I'm going to use loppers as well as hand pruners. So I'm going to first start off with loppers. So with loppers, for the most part, again, it's a lot of what are you doing, right? So are you having to reach? Are you having to go overhead? So the big thing with loppers is lever arm. So what I mean by that is when my hands are close to my body, right in here, that the weight that's on my spine, both my neck and my lower back, is fairly minimal because the distance between the weight of this to my body is small. As soon as my elbows leave my body, whether I'm here, down low, up high, there's more weight on my spine. Gravity wants to pull it down more. It actually has a bigger advantage to pull it down more. So there is how far away is your lever, okay? And of course, there's also how big is the diameter of whatever it is you're trying to lop off. So when I have the loppers this far apart and I'm having to close down against a bigger branch, again, the branch is going to resist, okay? And I'm going to have to brace a lot harder with not only my trunk muscles, but then we're going to talk about the rotator cuff as well. So if I'm doing lopping, the goal would be, again, of course, if I'm right here doing things, it's very easy to keep everything in neutral. My elbows are by my side, my chest is tall, I'm moving my feet to make sure that my hands and feet are moving in the same direction. So this is kind of the ideal zone in terms of height and, of course, the distance away from my body. But of course, nothing is ideal in life. So if I had to go overhead, the danger is, of course, as I'm going overhead, that I'm going to be more in extension with my back, more in extension with my neck, and of course my shoulders now have to stay overhead, which is, from a rotator cuff perspective, there's more risk of impingement depending on how strong you are and your ability to stay in this position and not shrug, or just depending on how much arthritis your shoulders have to not hurt themselves. So again, when I go overhead, I would have to tighten my abs, tighten my glutes to help provide a neutral base for my lumbar spine to not hyperextend. When I'm looking up, I have to make sure that instead of letting my head shear back to look up, I have to look up and stretch my neck up and stretch my chin up. When I stretch my neck and my chin upwards like so, what you'll see the difference is, instead of me creasing backwards because the weight of my head is just flopping back in space to look up, I have to really use a lot more of my neck muscles to hold myself here and stabilize, but this protects my ligaments a lot more against whatever the force that I'm dealing with overhead, okay? And lastly, as I go up, I really have to lift my chest and keep my shoulder blades down to not end up in this position, which not only creates impingement from my shoulder, but potentially creates compression from my neck from below. So again, ideally when you're going overhead, abdominals tight, gluteals tight, chest tall, lift my chin up, press it up, and then I reach up, but I'm trying to be aware to keep my shoulder blades down to lop, okay? And I get that's a lot to think about. So the other thing we talk about is making sure to be aware of, you could always move the surface up to you. So again, you would get a step stool if you needed to raise your ground up essentially, or bring the height down to you. So now I don't have to look so high up. I don't have to twist my back so much. I can just be right here. Again, the lever arm's a little closer. So there's nothing wrong with using a step stool. Again, obviously we know that there are not points in everyone's yards where a step stool is ideal, but you want to think about those things before you go out in the yard just so you're not placing your body at an awkward position, okay? If I am going down low and usually going behind something, that again, the thing is that people tend to side bend their bodies and twist because they're trying to get in somewhere. So again, if I'm trying to reach behind a object to do the pruning, I would try and squat down to the level of the object. I would try and keep my chest tall. Again, as I reach forward, I still have to be aware to kind of gently push my shoulder blades down to not create a shrug. And I have to keep my chin in and not look forward at the object that I'm dealing with. So again, chest tall, knees bent, abdominals tight, chin here, and I'm doing this, okay? Again, I know it's a lot to think about, but hopefully you only have a few branches back in there. And I'm gonna bring out the electric hedger for later because sometimes it works more efficiently when you're doing these positions because it goes a lot faster. But sometimes you just wanna lop a few things off. And so we wanted to go over how to use this tool effectively. Lastly, the diameter of whatever it is you're gonna lop is critical for the neck and the shoulders, okay? So again, when I apply a force like this and I start to close, if I don't have strong shoulder muscles, then I tend to want to tighten my neck and engage my upper trap to help stabilize. And of course, as we talked about, not only are we compressing our neck from below, but then we have the shear force. So when I am gonna go press inwards, I really have to think about pressing the crown of my head, the tallest point, and then I have to tighten my pec muscles incredibly hard and what is called my serratus, which lives here. And the idea of using my pec and this serratus is that they will not let the upper tract try and take over. So I'm using my scapular depressors and protractors to let me hold my shoulders in position to provide a stable base without putting my neck at risk. And by tightening my scapular protractors, that serratus and my pec, what that does is when they're not tight, when they're not doing their job, the rotator cuff has a lot more shear force placed on it. So again, I would push close, and if I were not tightening these areas, the rotator cuff would feel like it has to shift around a lot more to help stabilize the shoulder blade because the big shoulder blade muscles are not doing their job. So when the pec and the serratus are doing their job, the rotator cuff is still working, it just does not have to work as hard, and there's less risk of having labral tears or rotator cuff strains. Lastly, if you have to go down low and your knees just don't have it in them, then there's nothing wrong with grabbing another device. Again, the beauty of using your legs is they do provide a stable base, which is more effective for your shoulders to work off of. But if you have to get down low for something, I could come here, keep my chest tall, and lop down low if need be, okay? So now we're gonna move on to hand pruning because they do involve some of the same thoughts about how to hold your body, it's just less force. So when we have hand pruning, the good news is we have one hand free, and I'll explain why that is critical in a moment. But I still would have to think about where it is that I'm going. You know, am I going up, am I going down, or am I in the middle? Again, just the weight of my arm out in space is still leverage. So over time, if I'm not being careful and I'm in this position, it's not very much flexion, but it could really pull my back. So I really still have to be mindful of when my arm is out in space or my elbow has left my body, of being aware of trying to keep my chest tall. And again, you probably don't necessarily need to tighten your abdominals or your gluteus as hard as you would if you're contending with the force of a lopper, but you still would want to keep everything tight if you're bending your knees and you're starting to reach out, because again, the longer the lever, I could still feel that force on my body. So I'd have to tighten my butt, tighten my abs, keep my chest tall to not end up in this position. As we talked about before, if you're going up, I would still have to be aware of keeping my chest tall. Again, I may not have to look up as high as a lopper, but I still would want to lift my chin up. And again, I'm trying to almost imagine my neck is pressing the weight of my head off of my body. So again, I'm pressing the weight up to help open up or traction the joints inside my cervical spine. So usually working with pruners in this fashion is relatively easy for most people to get. It's when it starts dropping down to knee level. So again, what you have to think about is, again, what's the health of my knees? Can they hold a squat? So ideally, if I am pruning, I could use my free hand now to traction my back, support my body weight, bend my knees, and stay in this position if I'm trying to get down low for a rose bush or any other plant. So again, when I hold I could do it again without anything, but this becomes a lot more work for my back muscles and my quads. Here, by tractioning, I can stabilize a little bit longer, okay? Again, there's nothing wrong with using various height stools if you think your knees just don't have it in them to stay down low. And we'll go over why you might want to use one over another, and then again, the risk of using different heights depending on what you're doing. So if I had a yard work stool that was this high, of course this is nice, feels comfortable to my legs. Again, I would still want to be careful though, because I could still have flexion on my spine if I bent all the way down low. So I'd want to have my hand here on my thigh. I'd want to keep my chest tall. And again, I might still have to brace my abdominals like 20 or 30% depending on how much force was out here, or again, how tired or how long I had been in this position, okay? If it was lower and you were having a hard time getting down to the ground because, again, maybe you're having a hard time reaching because your hips don't have the flexibility to get down without rounding, we could use a lower stool. But the danger with a lower stool, and again, I'm not saying you can't use it, but the danger with a lower stool is that when people sit on a lower stool with their knees in front of them like so, and some yard work stools are this low, is that my back is now kind of kept in this rounded position, okay? So if you have a low stool like this, because you really are trying to get down to ground level to get different types of plants, if you have the flexibility, it is more ideal to keep one knee back, because now what happens is automatically by keeping my hip back in this position, my back has an easier time maintaining neutral, my trunk has an easier time maintaining neutral. So then if I'm reaching down, I can pivot through my hip joint as opposed to bending over at my waist. I can still traction my back with my hand, and I can reach down and I can grab some of these objects down here to help prune. So like I said, the hard thing with pruning is that obviously there's usually many different types of elevations, different types of plants, but hopefully some of these tips and tricks give you ways of pruning safely to not only protect your back and your neck and your shoulders, but also ways of kind of preventing forearm fatigue, because if I'm out here in these positions for long periods of time, this is a lot more stress on my wrist extensors and flexors. And so when I'm here, this is much kinder. So with pruning or lopping, I would encourage you again to watch the video a few times, apply it to maybe different parts of your yard. They might need different types of tricks, but hopefully with the information you can prevent repetitive stress. So weed whacking is nice because, again, if you're looking to knock down a lot of weeds at once, this is the way to do it. Again, the hard thing with weed whacking is you have the weight from whatever the motor is, and then the lever arm itself, okay? Now this particular weed whacker, it has a large battery pack, but the best thing about it is it's long. So the problem with a smaller weed whacker is a lot of times they're shorter, which the tendency is for people to start bending over to get the weed whacker to touch the ground. So I'm just going to say for demonstrative purposes, if the weed whacker had a shorter neck, I would want to, people tend to start doing this with their bodies. And so ideally you'd have to be aware of kind of bending your knees if you're using your weed whacker. Again, the other thing that tends to happen with weed whacking is that people tend to plant their feet and start twisting their bodies like so. So again, ideally with a weed whacker, you are making sure to move your feet and your shoulders all at the same time to help stabilize your back against any rotational forces. And then there is the weight of the weed whacker itself. As we talked about the hedging video, if I am lucky enough to be doing something, I would say relatively simple, meaning all the weeds are directly in front of me, it's not that hard, I could almost hold the weight of the motor against my hip and use my biceps to unload it versus having the weight just kind of hang down on my arms like so. So again, if I'm right here, this is great. The problem, of course, becomes when you're having to reach further out or longer levers, because now you're contending with this force that wants to drag you down. So in cases where you have to reach or you're edging, then what we would say would be you'd have to make sure that if I'm going to edge something, that I'd want to put one foot in front of the other as opposed to squaring up my feet, because it's a lot easier to get pulled forward by the force of the weed whacker. I'd want to keep my chest tall. I would keep my biceps engaged, my pecs engaged, because again, I'm trying to keep my shoulder girdle on so that my rotator cuff isn't doing this as the weight gets out in front of me. So again, if I'm having to plant, so again, maybe I can't move with the weed whacker, maybe I'm having to plant because again, I can't get closer to this area over here because maybe there's a wall or something. So I would have to engage my quads, keep my chest tall, shoulder blades down, chin in, and I'm tightening everything, and I'm still going to shift my weight to keep my back safe versus planting my feet and still reaching with my back. I still want to shift my weight, but again, I'm going to have to really be aware of using a lot more abdominals, gluteals, chest muscles, and using a lot more pec, and again, that serratus right through here, to not allow any forward flexion on my rotator cuff that would allow for kind of a prolonged impingement pattern. Also, when we are doing weed whacking, there is again the vibration of the weed whacker or the motor itself that we talked about with the hedger that can start irritating the forearm flexors. So besides switching positions with your hands, and this again is dependent on how your wrist is. In this case, if I can hold the weed whacker with my arm in neutral, this is a more neutral position for my wrist, which is safer for my wrist extensors and my forearm extensors and my forearm flexors. Again, you know, I could go here to here. Obviously, I might have to switch it around if I had to go a different direction, but sometimes this is more tolerable for the wrist to hold than to hold this position for long periods of time, because I have to hold my wrist up to not let the weed whacker drop down. So again, weed whacking is usually a nice tool because it lets us kind of get through a lot of weeding or knock a lot of weeds down fast. But again, if we're not paying attention to our bodies, it's very easy to kind of keep our feet still, let the weed whacker kind of drag here. So again, make sure to keep your feet moving with your hands, keep your chest tall. And again, depending on how long the lever is, really trying to be aware of, again, keeping your chest tight, pecs tight, and then again, changing your arm or hand position depending on how your wrist and elbow are feeling. As promised, I was going to talk about the hedger because again, occasionally there's a lot of lopping to do or pruning to do, and sometimes you just want to go with a mechanical device, which of course, again, it's always okay to work smarter versus working harder in terms of if you only have so much endurance out of your arm or back. So the one big thing about a hedger, depending on what type of battery type you have, is of course the weight of the battery, okay? So as we talked about before, this would be ideal. I could keep the hedger next to my body, so I have not only decreased leverage, but literally I could rest the weight of the hedger on parts of my body. And when that happens, I can use my body to help hold the weight so there's less disc pressure. As soon as this lever arm occurs, not only do I have to brace harder with all my arm muscles, but that is inherently more weight being pulled down on my spine. So by placing the hedger close to my body, I can rest the weight of this battery pack on my hip, and I could switch the hedger around depending on the size of the bush or kind of what I'm doing, and help support my body that way. Then, of course, that would be the ideal, but the life is not ideal. We have to then go over the top or down below. So again, if I'm going up, I then would have to be aware of, now there's going to be a lot more weight pulling down on my body because of where my shoulders are. My rotator cuff has a lot more stress on it just because of the sheer weight of the battery pack. And again, my neck has more pressure on the disc. Now, again, we've talked a lot about the lower back and this flexion force on the spine. But again, your disc the cervical spine disc feel flexion force as well. And again, if you're somebody who's had cervical pathology, when your arms are in this position, even without a ton of weight, gravity is tending to pull the body forward, okay? And so there's more pressure on the cervical disc, the ligaments. And so sometimes patients will say, well, this doesn't feel bad to my back, because for the most part, they can keep their chest nice and tall, but it's my neck and my shoulders that kill me. And again, the shoulder part makes sense because your weight is all the way out here, but the reason that your neck is bothering you is because, again, similar to the back, there's this flexion force occurring, and there's a compression force occurring at the disc, especially your mid-cervical, that can really put a lot of stress in this area. So when we do hedging and we have this weight that we're having to contend with, it is critical to keep your shoulder blades down to avoid shoulder impingement. But really, when I'm here in this position, what I'm working on is I'm doing my best to really engage the muscles in my neck to keep the crown of my head the tallest point. So what that's doing is engaging my deep cervical flexors, which are similar to my abdominals, and my deep cervical extensors, which are similar to my back and gluteal muscles. So these two areas are like engaging your own mini neck brace muscles to help stabilize against this long lever and, more importantly, this bigger weight out here. So again, as I'm moving, I'm really trying hard to keep the crown of my head always the tallest point, shoulder blades down, and of course, my abs and glutes are on because this is more leverage for my back. Even though my back can stay relatively straight, it's just more weight over time that wants to pull me forward. If I have to go down low to the ground to get underneath, again, I would want to make sure to bend my knees, not reach down this way because this puts more flexion force on my spine. So I have to bend my knees. I have to keep my back tall. I still want to keep my chin in. Oftentimes, as our arms go forward in space, our eyes want to follow our hands. It's very common we do it without thought. The problem, of course, is then my head is out here for an extended period of time and we don't think about that. And even though the weight is down here, my neck could still feel that pull over time because this is a steady force that's kind of just always pulling the neck, and the neck is trying to hold itself up. So again, I want to keep my chest tall, keep my chin tipped down slightly, but more importantly, I'm always thinking I'm pushing the crown of my head away from the base of my neck, which again engages those muscles again, shoulder blades down, and making sure to bend my knees. If I have to reach forward, of course, I want to make sure I move my hands and feet together, always to get around the bush. If I keep my feet stuck and I reach, then again, it's going to come from the back. And so I'm going to tend to twist from the back. I'm going to flex from the back. Your hip has so much motion. It can flex, it can extend, it can rotate. So we really want to use our hips. We want to be able to squat, pivot from our hips, shift around, get down. Really seek how to kind of use your pelvis with your shoulders to help your back stay in neutral, because again, your hip is so much more mobile than your lower back in terms of safety. You know, our lower back only has only so much rotation it really wants to go through before it gets irritated. The hip has a lot more range available to it that's safe if you don't have a lot of hip arthritis. So again, with a hedger, it is a great tool to use compared to loppers in terms of maybe time. It lets you get through things faster, but you're going to have to brace a lot harder with it because of the weight of the lever and the battery pack out here. And lastly, there's the vibration force. So with the vibration force, there's no way of escaping that. So you're going to have to get really good at switching hands, just because there's only so much vibration force your arm's going to want to put up with from a tendonitis standpoint. Again, when I hold it against my body like so, this helps those hands not deal with that vibration force because the body can hold it well, but there's very few probably positions this would be great for. So the last thing I would say besides switching hands, you could try and switch hands positions. And what I mean by that is when my arms are in this position, this is a lot more work for my wrist extensors, elbow extensors, okay? The muscle belly is about this big here and it's a lot more tendinous. Our wrist flexors have a much bigger muscle belly and sometimes can contend with prolonged forces better. So again, this is all dependent on how your wrist feels with doing it, but sometimes if you're going in these positions, your elbow or wrist doesn't become so achy when my arm is holding things in this nature as opposed to this nature, okay? So hopefully these ideas give you some ways of doing hedge work around your house without having flare-ups. Or again, if you hear somebody complaining down your street, make sure to refer this video to them and hopefully they can learn some tips and tricks. Okay, so now we're going to talk about probably the ultimate nemesis of everybody's life, which is weeding. Because of course, depending on what type of yard you have, like the weeds always come no matter what. And depending on what type of soil you have, sometimes it's really easy to get them out and other times it's really challenging to get them out. And you may not want to use weed killer because maybe you have a vegetable garden or you don't believe in it. So either way, we're going to talk about how to try and weed safely for preventing, primarily back pain is really the biggest one that people get because of just the prolonged position that people are in. So again, not shocking to people, you know, when you are weeding, ideally, you know, it'd be great if everybody could hold a squat for 5 minutes while they get into position, but usually it's this that ends up happening. And of course, we know that when our spines are in this position, that, you know, we have increased risk of disc pressure, increased risk of having nerve irritation, increased risk of stretching our ligaments over time. So again, we just tend to hang down in this position and it gets to people. And so ideally, we'd want to do it on our hands and knees, and that makes sense, and we'll talk about that in a second. But a lot of people don't like doing that because, again, if they have crummy knees, it just hurts after a while, or some people just have arthritic wrists and hands that don't tolerate being in this position. So with weeding, you don't necessarily have maybe the abdominal force or the stabilization you might need with your glutes or your back to contend with bigger weights like you would with a Maddox or a shovel, but it's just more the endurance to stay in a good position and be safe. So we're going to talk about different ideas. So obviously the first idea would be, could you do your hands and knees? Because it's the easiest, right? We like using this pad. It's called ErgoKneel, and we're not getting any kickbacks from this. It's just we found it's a very dense pad, And if you have mild to moderate knee arthritis, you can still do quite a bit of kneeling with 1 or 2 of these pads, and your knees for the most part put up with it pretty well, or again you could put it underneath your hands. So again, if I'm kneeling with my hands and knees, this is the most ideal because I'm putting all my body weight through my hands and knees, not my lower back. I would still want to be careful with my neck if you have neck issues because, again, sometimes your neck just doesn't want to hang in this position. So I'd have to be careful of keeping my chin in to keep my spine in neutral. So again, I'll bring my spine over here again. The challenge is when I'm weeding, I tend to want to look where I'm going. And so I tend to kind of want to hang my neck in this position, or again, after a while, people's necks are just kind of hanging down against gravity. So when I imagine I am pressing the crown of my head away from the base of my neck, it elongates or stretches these joints and helps keep them in a more stable position. So if I am here, I am making sure, again, I keep my chin in, I press the crown of my head away from the base of my neck, and then I'm weeding here just so I don't end up in that position with my neck, okay? Then the other thing that people will commonly do is they'll get down on their knees because, again, maybe they have decent knees, but maybe their arms get tired supporting them or their wrists get tired, so they end up in this position. And unfortunately for our low back, once your hands leave the earth, this position is usually as aggravating after a while as bending over because I am now holding all my body weight through my lower back, okay? So there are various ways you could do this. I could put one foot here. I could rest my hand on my knee to traction my back, and I could reach for the earth, and I would keep my chest tall. And again, for the most part, my back can be pretty happy here because I'm resting all my body weight on my knee, which is similar to putting my hand on the ground. And I could switch which hand I'm using. Again, some people's knees don't tolerate this position, so they would like to use stools. We'll get there in a second. But I would also remind people that, again, depending on where you're at, some of these balls that are burst resistant are really nice as well, because when you put your belly on the ball, one, you could potentially lift both hands off because your body weight is now supported on the ball. So again, if I was doing any sort of drip line repair, this is a nice modification. This also takes some of the body weight off of your hands. So if your wrists and hands get really tired or your shoulders don't like supporting your body weight and kneeling, I could weed and I could do this position, and it's pretty comfortable. It's also pretty comfortable for my knees because, again, the ball is supporting a fair amount of body weight. And like I said, I realize not all ground is ball friendly, but for the most part, balls can contend with concrete as long as the concrete's not too hot, or dirt as long as the dirt doesn't have huge rocks, because this burst resistant rubber is pretty good. But like I said, if you're kind of gun shy of a ball, then, and the only reason the ball is kind of nice is just because it's soft and big, you could become creative and find some sort of platform to do the same thing. So again, with the ball, or sorry, with the platform, I put it underneath my chest because then again, my hands are free to move about, to do whatever it is I want to do. I still want to keep my chin in to keep things in neutral. I could do drip line repair. And again, if you find something, I've had some patients who will take those plastic storage tubs that are pretty large. They'll flip those upside down and cover it with like a blanket. And it's the same concept. It's just finding something that works well for your body and your terrain and how long you're going to be there, okay? Obviously, you would still want to make sure you're moving this object around to get to your next section. So you'd want it to, and this is a little heavier than we'd like, so you want it to be a little bit lighter so you could shift around. But again, it's all about trying to maintain those neutral positions. And the hard thing about weeding is, again, it's not necessarily that it is hard, heavy work. It's just people are usually out there for much longer, so fatigue sets in, and that's when the breakdown starts happening in the body. If you're, again, just not a fan of kneeling because you don't think you can get up from the ground, or your knees really don't like it, then you could use a garden stool. But again, similar like we talked about with the pruning, you have to think about what position is my body going to be in So if I'm here, the nice thing about having a taller stool is, again, for the most part, my hips usually have a little bit more freedom of motion because my body can, again, go up and down more easy because they are not so kind of locked up to the chest. I still would have to be careful though, because now I'm still farther away from the ground. And so if I'm here, I could still hurt my back because I am flexing forward and putting a lot of stress on my low back. And over time, this can become aggravating. This would be safer, putting one hand on your thigh, going slow, keeping your chin in. I could drop one leg down like so. And the advantage of dropping one leg down as opposed to this position is I can only reach so far forward with both hips up, because again, I'm kind of locked in to this hip flexion this way. When I drop one leg down, I have a little bit more freedom of motion through this hip. So if I wanted to reach forward and grab some weeds out here, this makes it a little bit easier, okay? Again, if this feels challenging, because again, you're just so far from the ground, you can use a lower stool. So again, with this lower stool, as we talked about before with the pruning, again, my hips are all the way up to here, okay? So I really would have to be very careful of keeping my chest tall if I'm reaching because of how locked out my hips are. It's hard to flex down without wanting to do this because my lumbar spine's a lot more locked in, as you would say. So again, I might be better off putting one knee down like so, because again, now I have a lot more freedom of movement through this hip to help me pivot forward through the hip joint, keeping my chest tall. I could again rest my hand here. I could also potentially, if we imagine this is like a bucket of some sort, so you've upturned a bucket, I could put one hand here and reach out to grab things out here, but still unloading my body weight, okay? So hopefully these are different tools to help give you ideas about how to weed if you are trying to weed manually as opposed to using any sort of product or anything else. I will say that obviously the type of weed makes a difference. Some weeds have really tough roots and other weeds just come up right easily. So if you are going to go pick up a weed and you know that it's a weed that has tougher roots, even though it is not as taxing as lifting up a load of dirt with a shovel, again, depending on how vulnerable your back is, if you're going to pull this weed up and you don't engage your trunk muscles, I could still potentially feel a shear force, because even though I'm unloading my back, even though I'm trying to keep my chest tall, if I have to use force to pick up something out of the ground that has a lot of a deep root ball, and I'm not engaging my abs and my glutes, my back is going to feel that shear force because it's going to resist that tension. So again, if I come against a root or a weed that has a deep root ball, I would really want to engage my abs and glutes first and then pull, not pull and react and feel that pain. So I say that just because if you've weeded before, you know certain types of, you can just tell by the tension how easily it's going to come up. So if you go to pull and it's not coming up, don't, again, manhandle it. Tighten your abs, tighten your glutes, maybe dig a little bit around it, loosen it up, and then pull it out of the ground. So again, hopefully these ideas help prevent injuries that are very common with weeding and give you ideas about how you can weed safely, and again, more importantly, pass these ideas on to your friends, because I can't tell you the number of people that come in having thrown their back out by just pulling up 2 weeds. So I feel that, this, even though this is not as heavy of work as some of the other types of yard work, it's probably one of the more common ways we see back injuries occur. Okay, so I apologize, you guys. My wheelbarrow did not fit in the car for this part, so we're going to have to be creative, but this is my wheelbarrow portion. So again, wheelbarrow is one of those things where, kind of like shoveling, there's a lot of different forces at play. It's how big is the wheelbarrow? I mean, how loaded is it? What is it loaded with? And also, what is the terrain that you're on? Is it flat? Is it uphill? Is it downhill? So I will do my best to kind of cover all of those variables because they do make a difference. And then we'll also talk about how we would need to take all those same ideas and apply it then if your feet are now having to walk a much more narrowed stance as opposed to a wide stance, okay? So when we have the wheelbarrow, you know, one of the things to contend with is where are you gripping, right? Are you all the way at the ends, and usually the handles are up here, or are you having to grip much closer to the bed because, again, the weight of the lever is so great it is hard to lift off the ground, but now you are down in this position. So again, I think that's probably the first thing we have to consider. So if we have we're going to lift the wheelbarrow, I would be aware that as I go to lift, a lot of people tend to bend over and just lift with their arms. And again, they're keeping their backs in this flex position. They're shrugging their shoulders. They're going to hurt their necks. So again, I have to be aware that as I go to lift, I should bend my knees, keep my chest tall, tighten my abs, tighten my glutes, and then have my legs do the work to start lifting the wheelbarrow off the ground, okay? Again, we'd apply those same forces if we were lower down. We're just going to have to really tighten our glutes and really keep our backs tall because, again, it's a lower start point, and especially usually because if you're starting this close, there's usually, because it's full of rock as opposed to maybe something nice like bark, which is a lot lighter. The next thing to consider is where are you going to continue holding the wheelbarrow once you got it up off the ground? Meaning, can you hold the wheelbarrow up here, or are you having to hold your wheelbarrow all the way down here? And in part, that's due to maybe how strong your forearms or shoulders are. Because again, if it's bark, this is not that hard. If it's rock, this is a lot more fatiguing. People end up in this position. So really, it's more being aware of where are you holding and what is that going to do to your body. So obviously, if I'm holding all the way down here, there's going to be a lot more drag forward on my body and on my neck, because with this longer lever, it's a lot more torque on my spine. This is a shorter lever. This is a lot easier to stabilize against because my elbows are close to my body, my biceps are in a more optimal position. So again, if you find that your forearms are here just because, again, the weight of whatever it is you're wheel bearing is kind of forcing that position, then what I'm going to have to be aware of is, again, I really have to press the crown of my head up, and I'm trying to really lift my chest to fight this continuous force, because again, as I go to push the wheelbarrow is going to push back. It doesn't want to move. So I have to really contend against keeping everything straight and tall to fight that inertia of the wheelbarrow. The other thing you're going to have to think about too, if you have rotator cuff issues, is that when there's this constant drag, there's a constant traction stress to the ligaments of your shoulder. So again, if you're prone to having irritation in your shoulder because of hypermobility, you're really going to have to engage those pec muscles, and almost like you're going to squeeze your armpits really hard into your side to engage your serratus to help stabilize your rotator cuff so it's not feeling like it's being jerked around by the handles of the wheelbarrow. Then we have to contend with what is it that you're pushing, meaning like, are you pushing uphill, flat, or downhill? So if I am pushing up, of course the wheelbarrow is going to push back. And so ideally, when I'm walking, whether it's flat, downhill, or uphill, if I can maintain a wider base of support, push my knees apart, and walk kind of like a duck, it's better because I can use a lot more of my glutes, I can use a lot more balance to contend against the sway of the wheelbarrow. If I'm pushing on flat ground and I'm pushing forward, I'm walking like a duck, keeping my chest tall, tightening my abs against the force of the wheelbarrow pulling back, okay? If I had to walk uphill, then I'm going to have to stay a little bit more biased towards my toes. And the idea of staying biased towards my toes is because, again, depending on the ramp that you're pushing against, of course, there's going to be more of this extension force. So the steeper the hill, the more I have to kind of tighten my glutes, keep my chest tall, stay on my toes to maintain my center of gravity in a more quote-unquote neutral position versus hyperextension. If I am going down a hill, really gravity is going to pull me forward, right? So now, as I do my squat walk, holding my elbows by my side, tightening my glutes, tightening my abs. I'm actually going to be more on my heels, lifting my toes ever so slightly because I am purposely biasing my weight towards my heels to contend against a flexion force. So I am maintaining a little bit more bias towards extension to help stabilize in neutral. Okay? Lastly, there is the actual torque of the wheelbarrow itself, this side to side motion. So again, when I can walk with a duck walk, it's a lot better because I can again stabilize by keeping my shoulders and my hips in about the same plane. So now I'm going to face you guys without my ball. If I have to walk a more narrowed stance, because again, what the pathway that I'm walking on only allows me to walk this way, the problem is now I have this force that can tip me from side to side much easier because of how narrow my base is. So in this stance, I would really have to make sure I'm going to push my knees still apart as best I can with each step. But then I'd have to brace right here with my obliques. So again, what I tell people is pretend you're going to squeeze your elbows into your side and then you're going to tighten your ribs like someone's trying to tickle you. And so again, I'm keeping those obliques tight as well as my deep abdominal muscles to hold myself up so I'm not being pulled forward this way against the wheelbarrow, so that I can keep myself from being over rotated or side bent depending on how uneven the ground is, how uneven the load is in the wheelbarrow. Okay? And then lastly, there is the dumping action of the wheelbarrow. Okay? So again, so now you've arrived and you have to go dump the wheelbarrow somewhere. So when I go to push up here, I'm going to have to get underneath the wheelbarrow as best I can. And I get it's hard sometimes transitioning from this position to this position. So sometimes it's better to set the wheelbarrow down. And again, it's not always ideal because sometimes you're balancing on a ramp to go dump it. But as best you can, you're then going to have to shift your hands underneath it, keep your chest tall. And again, this is probably the most critical portion, rather than just kind of lean into it like this, because now, again, when you're leaning forward and this wheelbarrow has all this weight on it, it really can pull you forward much quicker, and it can really jolt your back because that weight's all of a sudden going to kind of pull your back forward, kind of like not as severe as maybe like a car accident, but again, it's going to be this very aggressive force that's all of a sudden going to stop because the wheelbarrow is going to stop. So again, we really want to control those forces so we can keep our spine in neutral. So again, I would bend my knees, I would tighten my abs, tighten my glutes, I would push up slowly, keep my chest tall, and then this is the hardest part. You have to really tighten your obliques to not let the wheelbarrow tip on that wheel as you're going to dump it out. So I'm doing my best to really brace and tighten and stabilize it as I dump it forward. Okay, so again, wheelbarrowing is probably one of the most challenging things for patients because there are so many variables at play. Again, you know, working with rock versus sand versus bark makes a big difference. The terrain, where you're dumping it on flat ground versus, again, if you're having to dump it up a ramp into something. So I would also recommend that, you know, you think about what is it that I'm going to have to do today? You know, what's the reality of, you know, how hard is it going to be? And maybe this is something that I would need to take little rest breaks. And I think people make fun of Caltrans all the time because they see 3 people doing one job. And the reality is, if you've ever had to wheelbarrow rock before, it's exhausting. It's like doing a bunch of squats with 25 to 30 pounds. The reality is there's only so many repetitions you have. So again, the last thing I would have to say about wheelbarrowing is, you know, make sure to take rest breaks. I mean, there's only so much your body can do, even if it's doing it well, to not have pain. So at the very least, besides having good form, have the sense to realize what the stamina is that your body has for wheelbarrow work, and make sure to take rest breaks, which is critical for injury prevention.